Welcome to our online discussion entitled Protests and Social Movements, part of the 2019-2020 Kupferberg Holocaust Center and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium, Authoritarianism on the Continuum, Complicity, Opposition, and Dissent. I'm Dr. Laura Cohen, Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center, located at Queensborough Community College in New York City. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. In doing so, we teach and empower citizens to become agents of positive social change in their lives and their communities. You can find more information about our programming and exhibitions at khc.qcc.cuny.edu. This year's colloquium explores current manifestations of authoritarianism and public responses voicing both complicity and dissent. It includes a year-long program of events drawing upon the community of scholars at QCC, whose work addresses themes pertaining to the ideological, political, psychological, and aesthetic conditions that undergird authoritarianism. The series was made possible through the generous donation and support of the National Endowment for Humanities, as well as the New York City Council. We're honored to welcome our two speakers, Dr. Mark Frazier and Dr. Deva Woodly, for what promises to be a thought-provoking dialogue. The colloquium is organized by Dr. Julia Rothenberg, the KHC's current scholar in residence. Dr. Rothenberg is an associate professor of sociology in QCC Social Sciences Department. Her pedagogy and publications focus on overlapping topics within urban sociology and the sociology of art, race, and ethnicity, as well as social and cultural theory. Welcome to everyone, and Dr. Rothenberg, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Cohen. I'd like to first just briefly introduce the theme of today's event. We're going to be talking about protests and social movements. For the past decade, under authoritarian regimes and bourgeois democracies alike, we've seen millions of urban protesters take to the street across the globe, sometimes occupying local spaces and other times bringing the work of their cities to a halt. Dr. Mark Frazier, professor of politics and academy director of the India-China Institute, and Dr. Deva Woodly, associate professor of politics, both of them with the New School for Social Research, are going to discuss these potentialities, the potentialities of the current wave of protest movements taking place around the world, and are going to place these in the context of also the current epidemic and its likely impacts. So first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Frazier in a little bit more detail. Dr. Frazier is a professor of politics at the New School for Social Research and co-director of the India-China Institute at the New School. His research interests focus on labor and social policy in China, and more recently on political conflict over urbanization, migration, and citizenship in China and India. His newest book, The Power of Place, Contentious Politics in the 20th Century, Shanghai and Bombay, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, examines long-term changes in political geographies and patterns of popular protest in the two cities. He's also the author of Socialist Insecurity, Pensions and Politics of Uneven Development in China, and the Making of the Chinese Industrial Workplace. So we welcome Dr. Frazier, and we look forward to his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Julia, for the introduction. I am going to put up the PowerPoint for today's talk, and as I'm doing that, I wanted to say how much I wish I could be there. We could all be there together today. I wish I could see the campus, the Queensborough campus. I wish I could see the Kupferberg Center. And most of all, I wish I could have a chance to talk to the students, take questions, and I hope we can work out a way where at some point I'll have a chance to reply to whatever questions might arise from my presentation and our discussion that follows. I also want to just say how much I want to acknowledge the very difficult time that the borough of Queens and the residents of Queens are going through these days, and you're very much on everyone's minds, including not just around New York, but around the country and around the world. I get messages from China, colleagues in China and India, students every day asking, what it's like in New York City, and it's just a very difficult time for all of us, and I want to acknowledge that before I start talking today about Hong Kong. So I'll start with a reference to an item that's on everyone's minds these days, and that is the medical mask, the surgical mask, the covering of our faces and our mouth for the purposes of preventing the contagion of the influenza. Of course, beginning last week here in New York, we all were required to wear them. Last summer in Hong Kong, masks had a very different function. They became quickly, after some protests in which the police used tear gas on protesters, they became a kind of iconic symbol of the Hong Kong protests that began really this very month of April 2019, so a year ago exactly. People in Hong Kong wore them to hide their identity, in part to hide their identity from police surveillance, police cameras all over the streets of Hong Kong, like they are in many cities these days. And also, of course, as I alluded to a moment ago, partly to protect against tear gas. The Hong Kong government in October of 2019 banned the wearing of masks. And this picture taken on the left was shown on the left, was taken the very first day that the mask ban went into effect, as you see, October 5th. And then 3 months later, in January of this year, as the coronavirus arrived in Hong Kong by way of China, of course, the government of Hong Kong announced emergency measures, and people began wearing masks to guard against the virus rather than guarding against tear gas. Meanwhile, the ban on wearing masks in public remained, but obviously the ban was not enforced. And so it's the mask and masking that ties together this talk today on protests and pandemics and public sphere in neo-colonial Hong Kong. So I'll make 3 points, covering 3 points. First, the protest movement that began a year ago is often regarded as and viewed as a pro-democracy movement, and that's true in part, but I think it's also very useful to think about these protests as a kind of 21st century version of an anti-colonial movement. That government in Beijing has the authority, or the government in Beijing has the authority to appoint the local governor or chief executive, as the official in Hong Kong is called. Not directly appointed by the head of the Chinese Communist Party, but through a sort of rigged electoral process is how it works. You may have also heard that the Chinese government, the army of the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, has a garrison of troops stationed in Hong Kong. And the government of Hong Kong exercises, and Beijing, through the government of Hong Kong, exercises many powers similar to empires of the past. And the second point I'll talk about is the close connections that you can see between colonial rule, of course, which has a very long history, and the outbreaks of and management of pandemics. And third, I'll finish with something of a metaphor about the masking of, or the kind of covering of, and even silencing of the public sphere in Hong Kong. So as many of you probably know, Hong Kong was a British colony before 1997. And as you see on this slide, during the 19th century, after wars in which Britain had declared on the Chinese Empire, in the name of free trade, by the way, Britain, having won what was called the Opium War in 1842, signs a treaty and gains the island of Hong Kong, which you see on the screen on the map on the right, the sort of center right small island that has the word Victoria written on it. That was the island that was ceded at the end of the Opium War in 1842. Later on, across the 19th century, through another opium war, under the so-called Second Opium War, Britain gains control of the Kowloon Peninsula, which you see on the map is about where that word Hong Kong and then UK below it is written. And then finally, at the very end of the 19th century, something called the New Territories, the area extending up to the formal border with China, is leased to Britain for a period of 99 years. Well, by the 1980s, as that 99-year lease is starting to approach termination, and of course, you've had the People's Republic of China be established in 1949. And in the 1980s, the leadership of China is beginning the economic reforms. And the idea of recovering Hong Kong and all of its vast amounts of wealth, its financial capital, its technology, its access to all sorts of technologies and capital markets becomes very appealing. And so there are negotiations. And by 1984, an agreement reached with, by the way, no consultation of anyone living in Hong Kong. This was an agreement between Margaret Thatcher, at the time the Prime Minister of Britain, and Deng Xiaoping, at the time the leader of China. And as part of that agreement, it would be to return all three of those portions of the territories that Britain had gained in the 19th century back to China in the year 1997. And in 1990, before obviously the formal return of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty, there was an agreement put in place known as the Basic Law. And the Basic Law allowed Hong Kong to keep many of the institutions that were viewed as being extremely important in Hong Kong's prosperity. Independent judiciary, civil liberties of various sorts, free press included among them, overall a strong rule of law. And the mini constitution, or the Basic Law, said that there would be one country and two systems, where Hong Kong was a second system, a capitalist system, as the law explicitly stated. China was a socialist system, that they would operate under, as different economic systems would operate under very different political institutions. And what is so important in today's debate, and even this week's most recent actions taken by Beijing, there was a clause in the Basic Law that said China and the central government, as well as any local government in China, were not allowed to interfere in the affairs of Hong Kong. Now, it's important to remember that under British rule, Hong Kong was not a democracy in the sense that most people would define it. That is to say, yes, rule of law, independent courts, but in terms of elections, not allowed to elect the governor of Hong Kong. That person was always appointed by the Parliament in London. And there were district council elections, and then more broadly, legislative elections. These were designed in very complicated ways that basically undercut a lot of the representation functions, and even in some ways the electoral functions that you would see in a typical kind of democratic legislature, or in a city government under a democratic system. What the 1990 Basic Law said was that something called universal suffrage, which presumably meant everyone being able to vote. Everyone was able to vote, but it was really referring to being able to directly elect the head of the Hong Kong government, that this could happen at some point down the road. The other key provision, finally, about the Basic Law was that starting in 1997, this one country, two systems would be in place for 50 years until 2047, a very long time away, of course, in everyone's minds in 1997 and in the 1990s, but now we're getting to a point where we're almost halfway there, and that's very much on the minds of Hong Kong residents, among many others. And after 2047, there will be some kind of reunification that takes place between Hong Kong and China. And what this means practically is that Hong Kong will become another Chinese city in practice. So after 1997, Hong Kong is known as the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, as you see there on the left. And over the past 23 years, as I just pulled this kind of transportation map out to show you, there's been an enormous amount of infrastructure being built that connects Hong Kong with mainland China. So you see the metro map here of Hong Kong, which has grown a lot in the last 23 years, but also these connections to the city of Shenzhen to the north on the top part of the map. The city of Shenzhen has a larger economy and a larger population than Hong Kong does. In fact, it grew, it owes its growth, rapid growth, from its deep connections with Hong Kong investment capital, among many other things. There is a railway that one can take quite seamlessly. There is a border that you have to cross, but it's usually fairly a quick transition point. On the left side of the map, you see a bridge cutting across the Bay of Shekou, connecting Western Shenzhen to Hong Kong. So there's been this deep integration in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of many other aspects too in Hong Kong. Something like 51 million tourists from mainland China, not just Shenzhen, but the rest of China too, come to Hong Kong every year to see sites, but also to buy many products that are difficult to access, difficult to get in the People's Republic of China. And of course, many entrepreneurs engage in a kind of border trade, typical of what you would see at any international border. Now, what's been of great concern to many in Hong Kong are the moves by Beijing taken in the last 20 years, really, to violate what many people feel is the spirit and even the letter of the Basic Law. I won't go through everything on this list, but to point out a few of the most recent. You see in 2015-16, disappearances of booksellers. These were owners of small bookshops that published books themselves. Some of these books, many of them, the most popular ones, were kind of exposés on the doings of the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. The Communist Party, as you can guess, did not like having books published about their leaders. And these booksellers were disappeared, in the middle of the night or on a business trip to China. They may not ever come back across the border. This sent shockwaves through the Hong Kong community. There were other instances of business people being similarly kind of extradited in an informal, in an entirely extra legal way. The removal of two directly elected legislators who happened to be pro-independence. They wanted to have Hong Kong they had took a controversial stand of Hong Kong being an independent country. They were not allowed to take their seats in the legislature. So these incidents and many more like them are the context in which we have to understand what happened in 2019 was that the Hong Kong government, if it were any other context, it would not be such a controversial thing to say that we're going to have an extradition law, which says that if you happen, as a Hong Kong citizen, if you happen to commit a crime in France or Canada or America or mainland China, that you will be extradited to those locations at which you committed the crime. But in the context of what's happened in the previous 20 years, with Beijing vis-a-vis Hong Kong, this extradition bill was extremely controversial. And I have to say at this point, just this past weekend, I could put up a final line there, 2020, was that this was over the weekend of April 18th and 19th. There were 15 members of the opposition, the various activists, lawyers, even labor leaders and so forth, who were arrested, taken to the police stations, charged and released on bail. But this was a clear violation of that article in the Basic Law, which said that no interference in Hong Kong affairs. They were charged with having been involved in the protests and undertaking illegal actions during those protests last summer. But everyone reads this as a direct interference by Beijing in the autonomy of Hong Kong. So here is a partial list of the protests over the last 20 years. And as you can see, many of them are in reaction to the actions taken on the previous slide by Beijing. They are less about having demands for democratic reform than an overall resistance to deepened integration with the PRC through development and infrastructure projects. And it's important to remember, I think at this point, that A public opinion in Hong Kong, while almost universally concerned about what China is up to, there was last year a pretty strong division over the protests. That is to say that dividing lines were mainly across generations, so that older residents opposed many of the tactics that were being used by the protesters to draw out the protests essentially all summer and into the fall, and even into January of this year before the coronavirus struck. Younger residents, on the other hand, strongly supported the protest, even some of the more radicalized tactics, even some of the violent tactics that were used at times. And of course, young people joined them in droves. So the 2019 protests, as I'm trying to make the claim here, need to be seen as a kind of anti-colonial movement. Not in the same sense as the anti-colonial movements in Asia, Africa, Latin America, to some extent in the 19th and 20th centuries, but certainly sharing some of those traits, demands for local self-governance. I mean, while independence, outright independence that I alluded to earlier, those kinds of claims are rare, although I do expect them to increase. There is still room to demand, the upholding of the basic law, which says self-rule and autonomy, even if you're not fully for independence. There is widespread disaffection with political institutions, with the Legislative Council of Hong Kong, with the chief executive, even with the influence that the politicians from Beijing are exerting apparently among the courts and other institutions in Hong Kong. There is a sense among many in Hong Kong of being overrun by PRC companies, by tourists. There are large numbers of students from the PRC coming to enroll in Hong Kong schools. There are widespread calls for boycotts of PRC companies, brands, banks, even properties owned by PRC entities. And I did, in the course of reviewing boycotts and where this term came from, I was reminded that the term comes from an anti-colonial movement in Ireland in the late 19th century, when Irish farmers refused to pay their land taxes in protest against Britain and in demand for independence. And the land official to whom they refused to pay their taxes was a colonel named Charles Boycott. So we have this word brought down with us today as a economic move to essentially not consume or not purchase or not support a political target with which we disagree. Finally, police violence. You saw this if you watched any of the news in Hong Kong. Early incidents of police violence quickly led to dramatic escalation in protests, in the size of protests and the intensity of the protests. These, of course, police violence and responses to it are very commonly found in anti-colonial struggles. In this case, it is not PRC police or that garrison of PLA troops that I referred to who are going out and using coercive tactics against the protesters. It's the Hong Kong police, but many believe these days that the Hong Kong police are taking their orders almost directly from Beijing, that there's even some question of to what extent the Hong Kong government and the chief executive now really have full sway over the police force of the city. One of the interesting traits from last year's protests was the ability of the protesters to mass in very large numbers in one venue for one day, and then quickly to disperse and redeploy at another venue on the next day or the next week. Rather than, as was the case during some protests, some very high-profile protests 6 years ago in 2014, where it was Occupy. That was also a time when many cities, of course, including New York City in 2011 and 2012, had the Occupy movement. This was, in some ways, a kind of branch of that in 2014. But they learned their lesson in 2019 to not try to hold one place or occupy one place and wait for the security forces to break them up, but to quickly deploy. So you see in the image in the upper left, this was the Hong Kong airport, where protests were held on August 12th. That 27% of 7.4 million, that's not August 12th. That's on June 12th, when there were in the main retail and central business district of Hong Kong, when you had that very large protest. In the lower left, this is one of the shopping malls one of many shopping malls in Hong Kong in tourist areas. This one, owned by a PRC entity, was occupied briefly on August 5th. This table from an article that was just very recently published by one of the leading public opinion pollsters in Hong Kong shows some survey data taken from protest venues in August. They went around and asked the people at a protest site, which of these slogans that are commonly used best represents your view and the view of what you think this movement is really all about. And you see the bottom line, I want universal suffrage, is only about 55% of the protesters viewing that as representative. All the other slogans having to do with resistance, solidarity, local autonomy, much more reflective, again, of a kind of anti-colonial positioning. So the second point about pandemics and colonial rule, I don't have to have as much time today to get into great detail about the many historical connections between colonial governance and public health, including pandemic measures, but suffice it to say that public health, especially in the global South, is closely tied to colonial rule. Many of history's pandemics have arisen from global flows of goods and people, flows often set in motion by colonial systems of trade and commerce. And any public health emergency gives those in power, whether they are a colonial government or otherwise, the chance to declare extraordinary extra-constitutional powers. And of course, we're seeing this today around the world, in authoritarian as well as democratic countries, pandemics giving governments the ability to, as we're seeing in the United States, a wish to stop cross-border flows of goods and people, something, in other words, that the US government, the Trump administration, has been wanting to do all along. Another connection between colonial rule and pandemics is found in the way that colonial powers claim to have superior scientific knowledge to impose on the so-called traditional practices of the colonial subjects. This is less directly relevant to Beijing's approach to how Hong Kong has managed the pandemic, but PRC officials and the media, public relations, propaganda operations are trying to push the narrative globally that China's advanced systems of community management and monitoring have been far more effective in coming to grips with and flattening the curve and curbing the pandemic in a much more effective way than those found in liberal democracies. The PRC government is engaging in what some have called mask diplomacy. I just saw earlier this week 100,000 masks being sent to Mexico, and the expectation being that the Mexican government would be forever grateful and express gratitude to the Chinese government for the gift of these masks and other personal protection equipment. And to briefly return to masks, I've added on this slide, a page from almost 100 years ago from another port city in Asia that was also under British domination, though it wasn't a formal colony, and that's Shanghai. The fine print, and this is from the government of what was called the International Settlement, a kind of quasi-colony in Shanghai. And the fine print says that, quote, the intelligent use of a face mask or some convenient form of respirator when in danger of infection is considered to offer the best chance of protection. And then it goes on to say, it is known that in cases where masks were actually and carefully used in proximity with cases of influenza, complete protection was conferred. And finally, the proper use of the mask requires special hygienic intelligence on the part of the public, ending with something of a dig against the residents of Shanghai at the time. But this was, of course, in the immediate aftermath of the 1918 global influenza epidemic, which struck Shanghai and many other cities around the world. Shanghai did a little better, and this report is kind of talking about how effective the mask was in bringing about better results in Shanghai than elsewhere. I just bring this up from a century ago because it shows us that debates over the use of masks, whether they prevent or viral influenza or not, are nothing new. And finally, the masking of the public sphere. I'll turn briefly to in 2 slides to lay out a simple chronology of the mask and its odd evolution over the past year in Hong Kong. As you can see, it was on June 12th that tear gas was first fired by police to expel the protesters who were surrounding the legislative building. The mask quickly became the iconic symbol of the protesters, who, as I said at the outset, wore them to conceal their identities as much as to keep out the tear gas. In fact, that's one of the other uses of masks that we, of course, are familiar with, to conceal the identities of someone who might be engaging in a violent criminal act. And in the summer of 2019, reports of masked men were common where they would set upon labor leaders and activists and others at rallies in support of the protests, that the mask was being used to conceal their assaults on the protesters and their supporters. There was a very infamous incident in July of last year where masked men, set upon the passengers in a subway, a metro station in Hong Kong. In October of 2019, in part as a way to prevent people from concealing their identity, prevent protesters from concealing their identity, the chief executive of Hong Kong imposed a mask ban. That was the first slide, of course, that I showed you in the talk. And this mask ban, the powers to impose it were drawn upon an old colonial ordinance under the British, of course, the Emergency Regulation Ordinance of 1922 that gave colonial governors the power to declare these emergencies and to take extra legal measures to address a crisis. Now, continuing on this slide, we can see that in November of 2019, a lower court rules that the mask ban of the government was unconstitutional, to which the government of Hong Kong quickly appealed. And as that appeal was under consideration by the higher court, known as the Court of Final Appeal, the first coronavirus cases emerged in January of this year, in late January. In fact, it also happened to coincide with the first day of the Chinese Lunar New Year, January 25th this year. Carrie Lam, the chief executive, declared another emergency, this time over the rapidly spreading coronavirus. And about a week later, in great frustration over the Hong Kong government's inability to distribute proper medical equipment, including masks, medical workers, including many doctors, launched a quick one-day strike to demand that the distribution of masks be made free to the public. And they also called for closing that border, including the bridge border and the rail border, of course, with China. And these were demands that the Hong Kong government quickly decided to accept and concede. Finally, to bring us all the way up to the present, to bring us up to this month, the Court of Final Appeal ruled, not surprising to many people, ruled that the mask ban was in fact constitutional as long as it applied to wearing masks at unlawful assemblies, defined presumably however police and the government would like them to be defined. And also not listed here, but in late March at a press conference, the chief executive, Carrie Lam, banned public gatherings of more than 4 people. Now, this was not in response to the protests, but in response to the reemergence of some COVID-19 cases in Hong Kong in March. They've begun to flatten out, no new cases being reported. But it makes you wonder, of course, the ban on gatherings of more than 4 people that was imposed in late March is still with us. It was renewed until April 23rd, which, as we're speaking, is tomorrow. And we will see if that ban is extended, because it clearly has a very effective use in deterring and giving the police the power to break up potential protests in the name of course, public health, as it supposedly was designed. So in closing, I'll leave you with these 2 photographs of the same political institution. This is the building that houses the legislature, or the Legislative Council as it's known, in Hong Kong. The one on the left, as you can probably easily see, is the old British colonial building that was there before 2005, and in that year was replaced by a different Legislative Council building. The one on the right looks very much like a building you would see in any municipal government in mainland China. And I think it's very, kind of a striking way in which you see the 2, imperial powers and their architectural styles being represented in the Legislative Council building. So hybrid regime, of course, it refers in the political science literature to governments that have a mix of liberal and authoritarian traits to them, a mix of liberal and authoritarian institutions. And this is no doubt true of Hong Kong, as you can tell from some of the points that I've made today. Hong Kong has a mix of authoritarian and liberal institutions. And what I would like to add to this point is that it's not just hybrid in terms of liberal and authoritarian, it is also hybrid in terms of the legacies of British colonial governance and the present contemporary forms of power, forms of imperial-like power that are being exercised by the People's Republic of China and the leaders in Beijing. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frazier. That was a fascinating presentation, and especially interesting the way you linked the protests up with, this idea of the opportunistic nature of the pandemic in terms of the government. But we'll talk some more about that later after the next presentation. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Deva Woodly. She is an associate professor of politics at the New School, and her work focuses on the possibilities and consequences that politics creates for ordinary people. Thank you, Dr. Woodly.
Let me go ahead and begin. Today, I wanted to talk to you all about my research on social movements and their importance in democratic societies, with a specific example of the Movement for Black Lives, which I'm currently finishing a book about. And the book is called, and this presentation also is called, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. Okay, so the idea for this book came to me, of course, during the time that Black Lives Matter, or the Movement for Black Lives, had mass protests in the streets for about a 2-year period. And the reason that I was inspired to write the book was not only because I'm a scholar of social movements, but because I saw that the movement was in itself a very innovative and interesting case. But also I felt that people weren't understanding its significance as a movement, not only in terms of how it is the sort of modern instantiation of the Black liberation movement, but also because of what social movements in general do for democracy. Can you go to the next slide? So what I started thinking about as I was analyzing the movement and its significance is that the Movement for Black Lives was not only in itself a cry for America, the United States, to recognize the humanity of Black people and the structural conditions under which we often live, particularly in relation to the carceral state, but also it was a part of a cluster of movement activity that had been taking place since the beginning of the 21st century. And that cluster of movement activity, or the cycle of movement activity, I thought began in response, or I think happened in response to a politics of despair. And the politics of despair we sort of see in all kinds of evidences, including public opinion, including people's sort of reaction to and engagement with politics, but also people's regard for themselves as citizens. In any case, the politics of despair can only be disrupted by an insurgency, which helps to repoliticize public life. And I'll go on to say a little bit more about that because it's a really important concept. What we know is that the iron cage, what Weber knew anyway about the iron cage, right, what he called the iron cage, is that as institutions get larger and larger, they have an increasing rationalism and efficiency that aims itself toward institution perpetuating goals rather than to whatever the sort of original mandate or purpose of the institution was. And that means that institutions that are democratic become less and less responsive to the people that they are supposed to serve. Now, this is, according to Weber, and I also agree, a kind of natural inclination of large institutions, is this sort of bureaucracy and stagnation that starts to happen. But of course, that's deadly to democracies. What Weber didn't understand, and what we do understand, is that people are actually differently positioned with regard to the effect of this iron cage, meaning that bureaucracies and democracies and other governmental formations will still remain responsive to some outside groups, right, more than others. And that kind of inequality of responsiveness also has its own consequences. Okay, go to the next slide. So this idea of a politics of despair is important because it's more than just a bad mood, right? And it's even more than a reaction to non-responsiveness, although it is that. It is also the kind of, it is the disengagement from the idea, almost the forgetfulness of the idea of citizenship itself. It is people's sort of waning lack of belief, then even waning ability to even conceptualize their own power as citizens, particularly citizens organized and banded together to change the conditions of their lives. So for citizens, a politics of despair is characterized by a lack of institutional investment and public trust, suspicion of the social practices and habits of others in the polity, and cultural meanings that are illegible across difference, cynicism, and certainly doubt about the possibilities of political efficacy. For governors, the politics of despair is evinced and characterized by a retreat into bureaucratized oligarchy, right? Meaning that governors become more and more insulated, and they too begin to feel disempowered by the whole sort of structure of the system. Go to the next slide. The thing that disrupts this politics of despair, the antidote to this politics of despair, is actually what Iris Marion Young called the repoliticization of public life. And this repoliticization of public life is accomplished through social movements. And the reason that social movements accomplish this repoliticization of public life is because, not only because they sort of disrupt the way that things are normally, but because of the way that they disrupt things. The whole process of social movement, coming together with other people, discussing ideas, gathering in the streets, right, through a voluntary association and for a cause that you're pushing for, in order to contribute to the governing of your own life. That whole process is a process of politicization, which has positive democratic effects, regardless, actually, of whether or not the social movement ends up being sustained or ends up reaching its goals. Although, of course, it's much better if it is sustained and it does reach its goals. Even without that, the whole process of social movement is a democratic process. And so I'm arguing that social movements are not only a kind of coincidental accompaniment to democracies. We know that as long as there have been modern democracies, there have been social movements. And not only is it a feature and not a bug, But in fact, social movements are essential to the survival of democracies, and that's why we see them march hand in hand. Now, I think this is the case for most polities. They don't even have to be democratic polities, but certainly in the case of democratic polities, just the process of social movement infuses politics into situations in which people might have forgotten what politics can do and what their place in a polity is. Okay, specifically, social movements help to infuse polities with pragmatic imagination, social intelligence, and democratic experimentation. Now, this idea of pragmatic imagination is that social movements, even if the sort of people in the movements are not themselves pragmatists, often come into the streets with an idea about how they can get from where they are to where they want to be. Right? So this pragmatic imagination is not merely a utopian imagination, right? Imagining a better place, but instead it's about the steps that get us from here to there, whether in terms of our thought processes, in terms of our culture, in terms of policy, or in terms of all of the above. Social intelligence is, again, this idea of, this is an idea I take from John Dewey, actually, but it is the idea of how is it that we relate old ideas, right, things that we already believe, to new purposes in order to implement them in a way that helps us to understand and govern our current lives and situations. The Office of Social Intelligence is to help people make sense of themselves in the world as agents. And that means to connect old ideas with new purposes to be applied in a specific context in a new way. Democratic experimentation is just what it said. It's about creating new forms of participation and governance that hadn't existed before. So in the case of the Movement for Black Lives, the way that that social movement, which is a sort of consortium of different organizations, runs is a really exciting example of democratic experimentation, because it's neither completely horizontal nor completely vertical. It's a federated table structure in which people have representatives on different skills-based tables. So for example, they have a policy table, they have a media and communications table, they have an organizing table, right? And so representatives from different completely independent organizations sit on these tables and make decisions. They do take decisions for what will happen sort of movement-wide and how things will be coordinated movement-wide, and sometimes even how resources will be distributed movement-wide. Okay, so these three elements are really key for how social movements begin to repoliticize public life. And I should say that this repoliticization is not only for the people who participate, although they may have the most profound effects. It's also for everyone who's witnessing this movement, regardless of whether they approve or disapprove of it, because it's this fact of engagement, right? That's a kind of democratic participation that we can forget about in polities that are saddled with a kind of bureaucratic unresponsiveness and a politics of despair. Next slide, please. So in my book, I use the Movement for Black Lives as an example of a social movement that helps to repoliticize public life. And I think most of us sort of know the story of how the movement came to be, so I'll go through this relatively quickly. The Movement for Black Lives was actually twice born, meaning that the first time that the hashtag Black Lives Matter was used was in reaction to the failure to convict George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida. Now, I interviewed a bunch of people for this book, and to a person, these organizers at different levels in different organizations said that it was that moment of the lack of, after following that trial very closely and having no conviction come out of that trial, and indeed having Trayvon Martin posthumously vilified and blamed for his own death, that made a lot of young organizers really sort of wake up right? Now, many of these folks were already involved in social justice work of various kinds, but I think that that was a moment for a lot of young Black people, particularly progressive young Black people, where they thought, oh, we really haven't come as far as we have been led to believe, right? So that was the first moment. It was a moment of kind of recognition. It was a kind of moment of politicization. It was a moment of waking up, right? Getting woke, as it were, in the sort of terminology. But in terms of the movement coalescing in the streets, that did not happen until 2014, after the again, murder, but this time police murder of teen Michael Brown, who was killed by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, that particular event, it obviously was not the only event of police or vigilante violence against unarmed Black people that had taken place. But that particular event became a catalyst for movement because, one, there were all these young progressive activists all over the country that were already attuned for such a movement. And two, because that event was quite egregious and was broadcast online, right, especially on Twitter, by the people who were present there that day. And there were spontaneous local protests that then grew and grew as people from across the country flooded into Ferguson to show their support. Now, the reason for that is because this was a particularly gruesome incident in which Michael Brown was not only shot, but his body was left in the road for 4.5 hours in the middle of August. You can imagine that tableau. And that was broadcast online, right, on Twitter, while major news networks were not yet covering it. And it had the whole, the whole internet, the whole sort of network of Black folks online enthralled and enraged. And so you had this kind of confluence of indigenous organizations that were already there, ready to protest, and all of these people who had been attuned by earlier events to want to do something the next time this happened. Okay, so all of these people massed in the streets in Ferguson, but it's not only about that particular protest. As people are there in the streets over what ended up being about 100 days, they started to form new organizations and to create what eventually they came to call the Movement for Black Lives. Okay, go ahead, thank you. Next slide. This is a timeline of deaths in the beginning of, or highly publicized deaths, most of which were had video recordings or evidence that was circulated online during this time. And it created a kind of fever pitch, right, for people, both people who were going to be going out and protesting in the street, but also for others who were just sort of witnessing these acts online, especially, but not only Black people. We can talk a little bit later also about the public opinion changes that happen that are quite dramatic for white liberals and white Democrats during this time as well. Anyway, go ahead. Again, next slide, sorry. Okay, so what we know about movements is that they emerge from more than mere grievance. Grievances are ever present because resources are scarce, inequality is a fact, and systems of governance, including democracies, tend toward this oligarchy and bureaucratization I've been talking about. Instead, movements emerge when people come to understand their grievances as being caused by the status quo arrangement of power, while simultaneously coming to believe that protesting that arrangement is urgent and efficacious, right? So that's one of the things that really happened in Ferguson, is that, very much like the case of Mark was talking about, the police response was so outsized that it actually ended up spurring on more protests rather than repressing them. There are some pictures, I think, a little bit later in my presentation, but many of you will probably remember that the little police department in Ferguson came out with tanks and long guns and sort of military grade and indeed military cast-off weapons to face unarmed protesters in the streets of Ferguson who were saying things like, hands up, don't shoot, right? So the tableau was just so stark. And it was being broadcast on social media, and more people were flooding in. And soon, actually, national media was flooding in, and the police were no gentler with reporters than they were with people who had come to protest. And that also created this feeling that this was an urgent moment that could also be efficacious, not only because you had all of these organizers with experience who were flooding into Ferguson from all over the place, people who already worked for and had connections to and skills that they're bringing from the United Nations and Emily's List and Chicago organizations, like huge progressive organizations. They already have skills and connections that they're bringing from these places, but also they have what ends up being a sympathetic ear from media who are actually having their reporters arrested, right, in Ferguson for reporting the news and broadcasting these, for what are, in the American case, crazy pictures of police on tanks and yelling about protesters being the enemy, for example. Okay, next slide. So this is just a sort of example of one of the reactions of people who were not in the actual protest, but were viewing this whole incident, the set of incidents online, and the way that it became politicizing for a lot of people who were not actually in the streets. This is actually from my own personal Facebook page, but it is representative of so much of the conversation that was happening not only online between Black people, but in regular daily life. That it was a sort of revealing of a fact that many people sort of knew, but had not quite so intimately felt, that they were not safe in their own country, even under the regime of the first Black president, which of course Obama was president at this time. Next slide. One of the interviews that I did with Mo Mitchell, who is actually now the executive director of the Working Families Party, which is a national socialist party in the United States, sort of explains the feeling on the ground as people were massing in Ferguson. He says, "I remember when Trayvon was killed, it just hit me. And afterwards, I saw the way that case was handled. I saw the Sharpton led mobilizations and other stuff, and I felt really hollow, just hollow. And then when, I'm not even gonna mention his name, when that dude got off, it just really hurt. And I was like, damn, I'm an organizer. I need to be doing something. I didn't know what I needed to be doing, but I needed to be doing something. And Black death needs to mean more. I mean, our lives need to mean more. If they take our lives, they need to feel the repercussions of every one of our lives. Every one of our lives, they need to feel it. They don't. That's why they do this, because they can. And so I thought, if there's ever a situation like this again, I'm going to lean into it. I'm going to do everything I can do. I'm going to use all my resources, all of my relationships, all of my organizing skills, and I'm going to lean into that moment. So when Mike Brown was killed, I felt something. I was so inspired by how people responded on the ground in St. Louis. I was like, I've never seen anything like this. I'm going. Next slide. These are just some images from the protest, as you might remember. But no matter if you were there on the ground, for the people who were there on the ground, it was absolutely a transformative experience. And for even people who were sort of viewing from the outside, it was something that not only made people upset, but catalyzed a whole different way of thinking about movement. I'm a little bit later in the presentation, or I'm going to go on to talk about the political philosophy that the Movement for Black Lives has birthed, since its sort of catalyzation on the ground in Ferguson. But a lot of what sort of came out, the thinking, the intellectual thinking that came out of the movement after this day was all about the sort of passion that we see on the streets here and the sort of collaborations between the local organizers and the sort of national organizers that happened at this time. Next slide. Okay, so the political philosophy that came out of the movement, which came together in the streets, but was about the sustained contact of protesters in a bunch of different capacities, you know, during that long time of mobilization, I am calling radical Black feminist pragmatism. So in the interviews that I did with organizers, you know, and participants in the movement, I kept hearing the same kinds of concepts come up again and again. Now, they don't call, or they haven't called the political philosophy of the movement radical Black feminist pragmatism, but the ideas that I codify, and you'll see in the next slide, all come almost verbatim, person by person, as they're explaining to me what the movement is about. So the key thing for the movement, according to everyone, is to create a world where Black people can live and thrive. Now, that vision is a vision that is centered on a margin to center ethic and the conviction that if the most marginalized people are free, right? If we're able to undo structures and design systems in which the people who are the most marginalized can be free, then everyone can be free. This is a long and old idea, right, that goes back certainly to the Combahee River Collective of the 1970s, but goes back in Black political thought and especially Black feminist political thought to the beginning of the 20th century. We see this in Anna Julia Cooper, for example. Okay. But the reason that I sort of use these terms, radical Black feminist pragmatism, is I think that each term has a explanatory function in talking about what the movement believes. One, radical is a mode of inquiry, right? It's about the root. It's not actually a placement on the left to right scale. It's a way of approaching problems. It's the ability to think about how things might need to be uprooted, disrupted, you know, in order to create the new, okay? Black feminism is the episteme of the movement. It is about reasoning from lived experience. It is about viewing things with an intersectional lens and also having or inhabiting a margin to center ethic. Now, the pragmatism is the part that might be a little bit controversial, but I actually think that for the Movement for Black Lives, they're really not interested in a kind of utopian vision alone. They're very concerned with outlining the steps of how to get from the world that is to the world that we want to create. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. This is really relevant in the time that we're in now concerning the pandemic because with the entire world going through a disruption, right, and basically being shut down in a variety of ways in order to limit physical contact, this is an inflection point, a critical juncture, right, where normal can be reimagined. Right? So in that way, it presents what social movement scholars call a political opportunity. And some of the things that are a part of radical Black feminist pragmatism could serve us very well in this moment. So let me just go through the kind of the basic components of the political philosophy, okay? First is the political claim, right? Which is an ontological claim that Black being matters as such, okay? But Blackness is understood to be phenomenological, right? Which means rooted in lived experience, not any kind of biological reality, okay? Then there's the radical mandate. And this is actually a kind of paean that is recited by people in movement and was authored by organizer Mary Hooks. And it is about, you know, it it is a mantra that is done as call and response. And the radical mandate, it goes as follows. The mandate for Black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. When I first heard this mandate, I was most struck by that last line, to be transformed in the service of the work. I think that is part of what is so affecting about the movement itself and about the way that it helps to politicize people, Black people, but also others. This idea of being transformed in the service of the work is also a part of another concept that the movement has publicized, which is that of self-care or community care. It's a part of a politics of care, which is also central to the movement itself. Okay, so an intersectional lens. Again, the idea of intersectionality was also popularized by the movement, although of course it was penned first by Kimberly Crenshaw in a pair of law articles that appeared in the late 80s and early 1990s. But the Movement for Black Lives made this term of intersectional politics and intersectionality a topic of popular conversation. And not only on the political left, right? The idea that oppressions are not additive and that our structural position matters kind of all the way down is something that has also sort of taken root in popular conversations, even by people who deride the idea. I remember being astonished during the Kavanaugh hearings when Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, identified himself before his remarks, and he, of course, is no supporter of intersectionality, right, as a sort of positive political project, but he said, I know that I'm just or I may be an upper class white man, but, and then he sort of went on with his remarks. But I remember thinking, my God, this is something that movement did, and just discourse about the movement has made people be able to understand their structural positioning, even if they sort of completely disagree with our analyses about what that means, in a totally different and new way, which makes new things politically possible because it allows us to fight on new terrain. Okay. Then there's a margin to center ethic. This margin to center ethic I've talked a little bit about before, and it's basically the idea, which comes from Black feminism, that in order to build a politics of justice, you have to start with people who are most impacted and people who are suffering most, right? So you can think about that as bottom up, you can think of it as periphery to center or margin to center, but in any case, there's no notion of trickle down anything, and there's a deep suspicion of a universality which tries to iron out particularities. A margin to center ethic is based on lived experience, and so people's particularities really matter. The next thing is a politics of care, and I think this is what's very, very useful to us right now. A politics of care is an actual politics, not an ethic, right? Which means that it is interested in how we govern, right? Both internally in our associations and institutions and also in terms of governing polities, that is oriented toward intentional community rather than primarily toward natural rights laws. Right? So it is less interested in what we are formally given as rights and more interested in what we are actually able to do, right? What we are actually made capable to do through our interconnections in our networks. A politics of care is about how do we create a politics that is oriented toward taking care of one another and particularly taking care of those who are suffering most first. In this moment of global pandemic, I think that there is nothing clearer than nobody gets through this, right? Unless we are able to take care of almost everybody who needs to be taken care of, right? That is why you see so many polities turning toward thinking about people who are incarcerated, thinking about people who are in nursing homes, thinking about people who are unhoused. It's not just because people might feel bad for people in those situations. It's also because in the face of a communicable disease, a viral disease that spreads, we understand that the people who are the most vulnerable actually make everyone vulnerable. And this insight is actually what's at the heart of a politics of care, except that it's not only about viral health, it's about everything. Because this truth that we see when it comes to a global pandemic is just the truth of the world, right? When we don't take care of the most marginalized, it turns out that we are all less able to live the freest and fullest and most meaningful lives that we might be able to do were our institutions geared toward care for each other. These other three things, pragmatic imagination and democratic experimentation, I talked about before, but they're very central to the political philosophy. And the last thing I want to talk about is the liberatory aim. And this is really, I think, a very important component of this political philosophy, because the liberatory aim is one that resembles what Neil Roberts has called marronage, right? Which means that this is not just about freedom, right, in the kind of liberal sense, or really in any kind of sense where normally we're sort of political philosophers are normally talking about it. This is about rejecting freedom as a binary, right? Either you're free or you're not free. You're a free man or you're a slave, right? But instead, it's a view of progress and a view of process, right? That says that what we should always be trying to do is to get free, right? And getting free means that we are in an ongoing process of trying to create institutions, relationships, governing bodies that can care for all of us and each other so that we can exercise our capabilities and capacities in ways that improve our well-being and the well-being of the world. So, you know, in conclusion, the reason that the movements in general repoliticize public life is just because the process of getting together and creating goals and massing in the streets is a politicizing process. But there are deeper democratic implications as well, because as people view this massing of people in the streets, as people listen to the ideas, the demands, the orientations of those who are getting together in protest, it reminds everyone, whether they're involved or not involved, whether they agree or they don't agree, it reminds everyone of the place and the potential power of a citizenry in a democracy, right? And that is a critical reminder that we need in the midst of the politics of despair. And politics of despair is something that will happen, right? Sort of naturally as a kind of political entropy, as a result of Weber's iron cage, as institutions grow bigger and bigger and sort of have their own internal logic that no longer serves its original purpose of responsiveness. So social movements are a key part of any kind of democratic way of life, right, in governance that wishes to survive. And the movement for Black Lives has contributed a particularly interesting thing with its political philosophy and its unique institutional structure.
I have actually kind of related pair of questions, maybe to both of you, but maybe Deva could start with the response, because it was really fascinating and informative to me to place the context of the context, goals, and way of viewing the Black Lives Matter movement within this series of theoretical, within political philosophy. But I'd like to kind of swing back around to just the idea of the agenda, and this also relates to what Mark was speaking about as well. In your case, Mark, it sounded like you were talking about a very big tent, sort of, that in a certain way the Hong Kong protests were not all of the activists had the same set of demands or complaints, right? It was kind of very big tent. And I'm also curious, you didn't mention to what degree workers were involved? Like it was mostly a student protest, I assume, but was it able to harness any demands by workers? And I suppose that bleeds into immigrant populations in Hong Kong, whether that was an issue as well, or whether how much, to what degree that was discussed. I was particularly interested in the students from the People's Republic. Where did they stand on the protests? And just this idea of this, it seems like many protest movements today, and I'm thinking I'm kind of going back to Occupy actually as, kind of a recent model, are really, in some sense, one complaint is that they're unfocused. Maybe that is also their strength, but there is this kind of so then when after the protest subsides, then you kind of, everyone's back to their corners of claims. And I'm wondering also, Deva, you articulated kind of a utopian liberatory vision, going back to the Combahee River Collective and so forth, and those kinds of ideas. But I'm wondering to what extent that jives with the actual claims of actual members of and leadership of Black Lives Matter. How big or focused are the claims and demands? Will they become? Just maybe a little more clarification on that from both of you.
A point of clarification, the movement for Black Lives is not utopian. They're pragmatists. So absolutely not a utopian movement at all, which is not to say that they're not concerned with vision and transformative vision, but they are very, very much about the business of politics. And politics from direct action, disruptive politics in the street, to actual policy. And the Movement for Black Lives actually has a policy platform that's available online in 6 different languages that is very detailed, that was written by the policy table and published in 2016. And people still work from that as a playbook in their individual organizations. And it's true that many social movements, right, like in the social movements literature, they call them new social movements, right? Like that's what they've been calling them since the late 1990s, sort of resist the bureaucratization of the sort of 1960s or mid 20th century movements. But that's what's so interesting about the Movement for Black Lives is that it kind of learns from that and creates a decentralized structure that it does have hierarchy, right? People still take decisions. And while there is no sort of central leader or central organization, the people who sit on policy tables do make decisions about how resources will be distributed, which campaigns to run, kind of what they're going to be working with. At the same time, that organizations are autonomous to do their own work. So for example, BYP 100 in Chicago, Dream Defenders in Florida, Assata's Daughters in New York, Black Lives Matter Global Network in Oakland with all of its chapters, all of them are independent organizations and they do their own thing, right? Like, so some people are working mostly on decarceration and some people are working on direct service and some people are working on housing, right, or migration, right, or immigration, right, status, like Baji, for example. But there are national campaigns such as like Mama's Day Bailout, which is an annual campaign in which all the organizations contribute to and raise money for a bail fund that bails out Black women and femmes from prison annually on Mother's Day. And it's sort of grown year on year since 2017 when it was implemented, so that now hundreds of people every year are freed through this bail fund. And it's connected to a reinvigorated set of bail funds that are not necessarily affiliated with the Movement for Black Lives, all over the country, right? Like, so the movement, although it does not mass in the streets anymore the way that it once did, it's still very much alive and quite focused, given the policy platform that it has, because the people who are in different organizations that do different things still understand the sort of goals of movement, right?
Thank you. That helped. And by the way, I'm sorry to use the term utopian. I meant more, I guess, visionary. That was a better term. Thank you. Mark, did you want to respond to?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think it is Big Tent in a certain way. That the protests of 2019 and even the ones earlier in 2014, Big Tent, but not in terms of a broad cross generational, as I was alluding to in the one point I made about the generational divide, but. One thing that people observed about the protests last year was the extent to which students, of course, and especially high school students, people who, in other words, were born after 1997 and never had any experience of the Hong Kong of the British period of Hong Kong colonization, and. The participants then consist of students plus recent graduates who are generally in kind of white collar occupations, service occupations. Hong Kong as a city, as a in terms of its economy, which was once heavily manufacturing, is now basically not very little manufacturing because the manufacturing has moved to China. So you have a group of, when you mentioned workers, besides the white collar young workers who also participated very actively, people who were self-employed, the say person who may be a middle school, high school graduate, if that, who are self-employed, running small shops, running food stalls. These people supported the protesters to the best extent we can tell, and were very upset by the actions of the police, and would step in on the side of the protesters in those very large events. But you raised a very important point in the question about the immigrant population. So, out of 7.4 million registered population, there's at least 1 million from the PRC largely, although there are some from Indonesia and the Philippines. These are service workers of a different sort, engaged in home health care, engaged in child care and other kinds of home care duties, who are engaged in other sorts of low-skilled, low-income occupations. And this is where the movement has kind of a split. That is to say that a small, not half, but maybe a quarter of the people who are participating in the protests are coming at this from a very localist, some would even say nativist perspective, so that the immigrants from the PRC are viewed as part of the problem, that they are taking the familiar rhetoric of taking jobs, absorbing welfare resources, etc. So this is a kind of underreported part of the anti-PRC movement going on in Hong Kong, and I think that's important to point out. The other axis here is that some among the movement, not just 2019, but in earlier years too, so strongly have such a strong local identity that we're Hong Kong, we're not Chinese. Therefore, the things that are going on in China are of no care to us. Even if something like a June 4th commemorating 1989, we're not going to go to that. That happened to people in another country. Why should I care about it? So it's this fascinating identity move of a so-called Han Chinese group, the ethnic group that makes up 93% of the 1.4 billion population in China, that there's this split within that group, and a very powerful, linguistically too, Cantonese being the language spoken in Hong Kong as part of this. So some, in short, differing orientations towards ties with culturally and otherwise and economically with the mainland.
So another question I had kind of I guess addresses the elephants in the room, but again, about the agenda of both of these movements, I assume are going to, moving forward, pandemic either brings up, highlights concerns that were on the agenda anyway. I mean, I'm thinking particularly around Black lives, and I'm wondering if moving forward, that is going to, if organizers, activists have thought about how that is going to take, maybe not center stage, but is certainly going to be a very important perspective as, you know, as police violence and so forth kind of laid bare, and having it recorded, laid bare to the world, to anybody who didn't already know the pandemic of violence against young people of color, but this is also, this pandemic is now again laying bare just this kind of structural racism, at least in the United States. I don't know how that's going to play out elsewhere, but I'm wondering if there's any talk yet about the agenda shifting or incorporating this, but also, and this is related, and also for both of you, that of course the strategies that you both talked about, urban protests, mass protests, as energizing as they are, it's going to be a long time before that kind of action is going to be, we're going to see a lot of it. So how is that going to impact both movements? And of course, the internet and social media have been really important for both. So that's kind of something that is, I assume, going to remain with us and even take a more of a front seat moving forward. So I guess agenda and strategies given the current situation. I know those are really huge questions, but if you could each touch on them for a couple of minutes, that would be great.
So in terms of moving for Black lives, mass protest hasn't been the main tool in their toolkit since 2017, when after Trump was elected, the FBI created a designation called Black Identity Extremists, in which they started to surveil movement organizations, and also threatened to charge people involved in those organizations under terrorism statutes. So at that time, state repression became not only what would happen in the streets, but things that were happening legally in terms of surveillance and court cases being pursued against people in movement. And so mass protests became much, much higher cost at that time. And so it hasn't been the sort of main way of engaging since that time. What has become the main way of engaging for the movement has been continuing to organize and doing direct service and electoral politics. And not just in terms of supporting candidates or parties. The movement still is not particularly interested in any one party as such, and is often disappointed with the Democratic Party. But it does run candidates and support candidates in local races, and even for national office, you know, and those candidates often run as Democrats, but there are people like Ayanna Pressley, who was staffed primarily by a Black woman and a Latina woman who come from movement, right? People like Stacey Abrams of Georgia, who is staffed by a woman who comes from movement. And it's also about the creation of an infrastructure of organizations like Black PAC, Higher Heights for America, which are basically organizations that seek to recruit, train, and fund Black women and women of color for especially local office, but also national office, right? And there's the Electoral Justice League, and there are also media and communications institutes and trainings like Channel Black and Culture and Society, and places where people can go to learn communication skills that are meant to be used in pursuit of the goals of movement. So it's about the creation of this whole infrastructure of political idea making and communication, and also the means to, you know, build and grab power that has become really key for the movement. And that's in addition to, you know, decarceral work, right, in terms of getting people out of prison. That's a lot of what the movement has always been interested in, but has really ramped up during the COVID crisis because, of course, prisons and jails are breeding grounds for this disease. And especially in terms of jail, it goes right along with what the movement has always wanted to do in terms of ending cash bail, right? And decarcerating, particularly for people who have not been convicted of any crimes. So that is what has been happening in terms of internal calls for the movement, is really focusing on those ideas of putting attention to things that were already priorities but become very extremely important in this moment.
Yeah, I would add, or I'll begin my remarks by reflecting back on Deva's point about politics of despair moving to repoliticization of public life, and the importance of coming together of the gathering as a process that helps to renew democratic politics and its positive effects in many ways. And so, yeah, I mean, here we are at a moment in which physical gathering is constrained, and will it be sufficient to, especially given the kind of generation that may have grown up pretty used to socializing with smartphones, will it be sufficient to gather in this way of doing it by digital space rather than actual civic space? And I think that will be a really interesting thing to see coming up everywhere in the world in the next year, particularly in the U.S. In Hong Kong, it will be. There's also an electoral politics versus social movements kind of distinction or debate going on. In November of last year, there were district council, not for the city-state legislature, but for district councils, in which the opposition mobilized extremely effectively and won something like 80% of the seats. And these are not extremely powerful sorts of councils, but they do a lot of community engagement and community governance of small public services and things like this. This will be very interesting to see the extent to which these district councils are able to, engage and vitalize the broader goals of the movement and its participants. There's also a kind of like in the U.S., we have in November 2020 coming up with the presidential and other national elections. In Hong Kong, the legislature has elections in September. So these will be an opportunity for electoral politics to come in. But what's on most people's minds is, as I mentioned a couple of times in the talk, the way in which Beijing is using the shutdown to launch, to what everyone says is a massive escalation of repression and just pushing aside of the basic law. And so the concern is that this hardline approach will lead many, every I guess social movement has, generally speaking, a kind of division in tactics between those who want to, use confrontation and those who are more amenable to or have a stronger preference for a mix of confrontation and negotiation, and some who are strongly on the side of all nonviolence at all times. But in Hong Kong, there is a concern that that those who were, willing to stand toe-to-toe with the police, willing to shatter a few windows for effect during the protests last year, on a few occasions last year. It's a small minority, but they will sort of take over the, not in a leadership sense, but kind of take over the initiative or take the first steps in some of these protests that we are sure to see. I mean, I think the pandemic situation in Hong Kong is looking better in such a way that when we start to come up on anniversaries, June 4th, this year it will be June 9th and June 12th to mark two huge protests from 2019. There's always a large march on July 1st. the thinking is that the government of Hong Kong will say, well, we're not going to grant permissions to protest this year because of the way things are, that people will still come out and do the protest, that the police will call it an illegal assembly, someone will throw something, and then you just really, one of the leaders of the democratic movement in Hong Kong, Martin Lee, who was arrested last weekend, was in The Guardian today quoted as saying he's just gravely concerned that will be a violent shooting on the streets of Hong Kong as early as June when these anniversaries start coming up. So that's sort of the complicated nature of the street versus along with the electoral cycle, both going on.
So we have to wind down in a couple of minutes, but I think Laura had one last question.
So I'm just curious about the tension, going back to COVID for a second, between the masks, intersectionality, and the existing movements, and how the use of masks might integrate or co-op or overwhelm what's taking place in Hong Kong and what's happening with Black lives. You know, I'm thinking about these tensions between the use of masks from a defiant perspective or from a dominant perspective, or domination if it's a government mandate, the role between the individual and collective use, the idea that for some masks are used for prevention versus other people, it might clearly be dangerous to use, and the notion of also protection versus the politicalization. So I just wanted to ask, what you all think about social movements now that there's this other layer of, sorry, an ambulance goes by, where the masks are really critical to public health, but also sometimes can be vilified and criminalized.
I think it's a very good point, and you put it very well, Laura, that they have these sort of multiple functions, multiple uses, multiple meanings, symbolic meanings, and I mean, I think looking forward, whether we're talking about Hong Kong or the United States or anywhere else, just even when if we ever hopefully do get to a post-pandemic phase, the mask will be a universal kind of object. And I think what makes Hong Kong distinct is this kind of ironic juxtaconvergence of a mask ban where, you cannot wear a mask because you're hiding we want to surveil you and take your picture and identify you as a protester. And now, the protesters can say, well, I'm wearing it as a precaution. I'm not wearing it as an act of defiance. And so there are these multiple meanings and strategies, and I guess the ways to play with the ambiguity of the mask that will be interesting to watch in the coming years.
Deva, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, right. The idea of masks and masking. Well, in the United States, the issue of masks has turned into one that is partisan.
That's right. That's right. It is.
Yeah. So you have people who are wearing masks, making the statement that not only that they hope to protect the health of the people around them, and they're complying with, in many cases, the law, but also that they trust and believe that there actually is a pandemic crisis that they need to guard against, and are therefore endorsing the view of scientists and intellectuals and media and all kinds of other liberals, right? So there's already a kind of partisan divide about that practice in the American context. And so, for Black people, there's an added layer of the tendency toward criminalization with the wearing of the masks. So that adds another layer of the political. But it's not as though there's not already a kind of political conversation that is going on with masking or not masking in the first place. So in terms of protests, that's another thing that will be something that we'll just have to see. First of all, if people are willing to mask in the streets, but also how people deal with that ambiguity. Because the thing about the movement for Black Lives is that even more so now than sort of in 2014, 2015, and 2016, the movement has connections and coalitions with non-Black peoples and is willing to use those strategically. And those people are also willing to be strategically involved. So if, in terms of mass protest, especially since protests are rarer now and more strategic, I wouldn't be surprised if you had if non-Black people, particularly white people, who were interspersed in the crowd and were sort of meant to be a part of an alert system almost, right? A kind of flag, a way of sort of flagging danger or excessive force or whatever. Not that would necessarily protect people, but, people in movement are already thinking about things like this. And since it's so deeply politicized already, you kind of have the potential for more than there would have been in, say, 2014 when this first sort of occurred. And that's one thing that I didn't say about the movement that I should have said, is that one of the other things that made me know that I had to write a book about this is that the movement for Black Lives, despite the complete front and centering and unrelenting focus on the fact that it is Black lives, not all lives, but Black lives that matter, is incredibly popular for a social movement in the United States, and is actually really popular with multiracial constituencies, and seems to have, in combination with the election of Donald Trump, really radicalized white liberals in ways that we had not seen. And I don't mean that in terms of anecdotes. I mean that in terms of the data on public opinion. Between 2009 and 2018, white liberals have become much, much more concerned with racial justice, structural inequality, right, the politics of race, in ways that could not have been foreseen. And it seems to be a combination of, one, the framings offered by the Movement for Black Lives, and then two, the wake-up call of the election of Donald Trump.
Thank you for joining us for our first online broadcast of our KHC events. Those of us who were in attendance on the Zoom meeting found it fascinating, very useful, timely, and we really hope that that you, our audience, who we would love to see face-to-face, and we're sad that we're not seeing you face-to-face, but we are really looking forward to hearing any questions or comments that you might have on this event, and thank you for checking in.
And I just want to echo that. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Deva. Thank you, Julia, for hosting such an engaging discussion. And please be sure to check the Kupferberg Holocaust Center's website, khc.qcc.cuny.edu, for more information on all of our programming, exhibitions, and educational materials. Thanks.